Good morning to all of you who are joining us here at Columbia University and the United States, and good afternoon and good evening to those of you who are joining us from Europe and Turkey. My name is Holger Klein, and I am the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies here at Columbia University. It is a great honor and a distinct pleasure for me to welcome you all to today's live online panel on constitutionalism and democracy in Turkey and beyond, an event that was conceived by Professor Fuat, Keyman, director of the Istanbul Policy Center and vice president of Sabancı University, who kindly invited us at the Sabancı Center here at Columbia, together with Professor Yusuf Leblebici, the president of Sabancı University, to co-host this event today. It is the second such collaboration, almost exactly a year after Professor Ayşe Kadiyolu hosted our first online workshop on autocratic legalism and the use of legality in authoritarian consolidation here in the same Zoom room on April 17th, 2020. I guess nobody could have foreseen back then that a year later we would still be holding our conferences and workshops in a Zoom environment. The good news, of course, is that we are all now more experienced with this new medium than we would ever have imagined, and that it has brought us closer together despite our physical and geographical distance from each other. Our audiences have not only grown in size, but have also grown closer together. Our reach has become wider, and our institutional ties with Sabancı University and the Istanbul Policy Center have become deeper. It is my firm hope that once we will fully emerge from this pandemic, our institutional ties and collaborations will have become stronger and more varied as a result of the new possibilities and potential we were able to develop in these pandemic years. And hopefully this will be the last of the pandemic years. As the co-host and co-organizer of today's event, we at the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies are most grateful to Fuat Keyman for bringing together a wonderful panel of speakers that includes Professor Bertil Emrah Oder, Dean of Law at Koç University, and our own Dr. Tsveta Petrova, lecturer in political science here at Columbia University. They are joined by Fuat Keyman himself and Professor Senem Aydın-Düzgit, senior scholar and academic affairs coordinator at the Istanbul Policy Center, who has kindly taken on the moderation of today's event. I would like to extend my sincere thanks on behalf of Columbia University to the members of the Sabancı family for their unwavering support of our center. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the staff of the Istanbul Policy Center at Sabancı University and the Stiftung Mercator Initiative for their help in preparing this event. Last but not least, I would like to thank the staff of the Sakıp Sabancı Center here in New York, especially our program manager, Sharon Kim, for her work on the poster and for managing our Zoom setup. If today's event is a success, it is in no small part due to the tireless efforts of the staff members at both of our institutions. And it is now my great pleasure to hand the podium over to our dear colleague and president of Sabancı University, Professor Yusuf Leblebici, for his welcoming remarks. Yusuf, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Holger. I would like to welcome everybody to this very interesting event that has been organized jointly by the Columbia University Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies and by Istanbul Policy Center of Sabancı University. It is our great honor to have distinguished speakers as guests in this event today. And as Holger mentioned, this is the second such event, and in the future we would like to hold similar events, but hopefully in a face-to-face manner rather than in virtual domain only. But for now, we would like to go on with this mode, which we hope will be beneficial for all participants. Without further ado, I'd like to give the word to our moderator, Professor Senem Aydın-Düzgit. I like to also mention before giving the word to Professor Düzgit that this also marks the centennial anniversary of the 1921 Constitution of Turkey. The discussion about the constitutionalism is still today, of course, a very hot topic, and I'm sure that all the panelists will have very interesting thoughts and observations on this. So without further ado, I give the word to Professor Senem Aydın-Düzgit, and I'd like to thank once again all the participants and the organizers for this very interesting event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Leblebici, and it's very nice to be here. I've already been introduced by Holger, but my name is Senem Aydın-Düzgit. I'm a professor of international relations at Sabancı and also the academic affairs coordinator of the Istanbul Policy Center. And I will be moderating today's panel. Now, our panel is on constitutionalism and democracy in Turkey and beyond. And we think that this is an extremely pertinent topic, given that we're living in an era in which autocratization, as it's been expressed recently in the VDEM report, is turning viral, and it's happening globally. We see on the one hand, 68% or so of the world population now living in autocracies, and now, going through what is referred to as the third wave of autocratization. And on the other hand, we only have around 32 liberal democracies left, within which only 14% of the global population resides. So we are dealing with a severe threat of autocratization, autocracies at the global scale. Now, of course, when we look at the major decliners in the recent decade or so, we come across usual suspects, including Turkey, Poland, Hungary, as well as other larger democracies like Brazil and India as well. Now, today in this panel, we're going to be focusing particularly on Turkey, as well as on Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, more particularly the cases of Hungary and Poland. Poland, for instance, as the country which seems to decline the most during the last decade. When we look at all these countries, we see a significant regression of fundamental rights, but also serious problems with their judiciaries, media freedoms, freedoms of civil society. So these are all issue areas that we're going to be covering. And of course, the notion, the concept of constitution and constitutionalism seems to lie at the heart of these debates as well. And in dealing with that, we're going to be talking about the history of course, the constitutions and early constitutionalism in Turkey first, to also have a sense of where we came from, as well as the current issues, problems with constitutionalism or constitution making that are faced today in Turkey, but also elsewhere. Now, in doing that, of course, we're going to have our three speakers with us to be discussing these topics and many more. We're first going to start with Professor Bertil Emrah Oder, who is the Dean of Law Faculty at Koç University, and she'll be presenting her speech on the paths of constitutionalism in Turkey, democratic erosion and democratic revival. And then we're going to continue with Professor Fuat Keyman from Sabancı, who's the Vice President of Sabancı and Director of IPC, and he'll be presenting on Remembering the Past, a New and Democratic Constitution in Turkey. And last but not least, we're going to have Dr. Tsveta Petrova, who's lecturer in political science from Colombia, presenting on Democratization to Populism, Constitutional Crises in Contemporary Central Europe. So we're going to begin with Bertil Hocam. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. At first, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Sabancı University, Istanbul Policy Center, and Columbia University for this very significant and timely event. The Turkish government introduced an action plan on human rights in late March, emphasizing the rule of law as an implementing reform package of previously announced judicial strategy. In this respect, the President Erdogan highlighted that the ultimate goal is to lay down the foundations of a new constitution to mark the Republic's centenary in 2023. The constitutional call coincided with the developments that perpetuate Turkey's constitutional backsliding, such as the withdrawal from the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention on the prevention of violence against women and domestic violence, and the disclosure of the pro-Kurdish HDP before the Constitutional Court. Still, there are no positive improvements regarding politically significant cases, such as the case of the philanthropist Kavala. And in these type of relevant cases, the European Court of Human Rights applied the ulterior purpose doctrine for the detentions, referring to the silencing of dissents and dissuasive effect. According to the Platform for the Protection of Journalism and Safety of Journalists established under the Council of Europe, 92 journalists are under arrest right now, with the highest score in the Council of Europe countries. The parliamentary immunities of 2 deputies from the main opposition CHP and HDP have been removed, yet the government puts emphasis Turkey needs a new and civilian constitution of the people, not a tutelage regime. Here I quote, the new constitution's text, which will emerge with the widest possible consensus, will be submitted to the nation's approval according to the announcements of the representatives of the government. And shortly after the announcement of the action plan on human rights and constitutional code, the democracy report of the Bidem Institute has classified Turkey as one of the top 10 autocratizing countries and the 3rd democratic decliner after Poland and Hungary on the ground of its recent scores in the Liberal Democracy Index and Electoral Democracy Index. However, Turkey has declined in the bottom of global rankings of the Liberal Democracy Index since 2014. At present, the regime type falls within the intermediate category of competitive non-democracy, namely an electoral autocracy, since the opposition can still contest by using democratic institutions. Under current circumstances, the electoral integrity has been secured mainly by a vigilant civic oversight, as observed in the Istanbul's repeated mayoral election in 2019. The main opposition's candidate won the election strikingly by causing a heavy loss for AK Party after its 25 years of the rule in Turkey's biggest city. As an incremental form of autocratization with popular support, Turkey's current democratic erosion occurred under the AK Party's hegemonic government that has held power for almost 2 decades. In contrast with a rapid and complete collapse of democracy by military interventions in 1960 and 1980, the current one represents a slow degradation, and it marks backslidings, particularly regarding the freedom of expression, shrinkage of the civic space, and dysfunctional and subservient judiciary. Although Turkey passed through autocratic cycles in formal ruptures and have never been categorized as a liberal constitutional democracy, the current erosion has come after a period of democratic consolidation. Notably, the AK Party government between 2001 and 2010 provided a democratization wave in Turkey. The constitutional amendments, various statutory reforms, action plans for policy implementation of human rights, and particularly the liberal democratic institutionalization, including the ombudsperson, human rights councils, national human rights institution, and totally new progressive legislation in criminal and civil matters, as well as the legislation on media and press, were introduced under the leadership of the AK Party. As a political project, the AK Party's ownership for democratization and Europeanization received full public support, and the AK Party broke the record of the winning the most votes of Turkey's electoral history in 2011 by approximately 49%. Here, the constitutional amendments in 2004 and in 2010 seemed to serve a leverage of public trust for the AK Party policies and Turkey's constitutional imagination. Against this backdrop, Turkey's democratic erosion features a double-sided backsliding phenomenon. First, the repressive policies over the civic space, the freedom of expression, degradation of the rule of law, employing unprecedented modes of arbitrariness and excessive legal formalism have endangered Turkey's liberal democratic achievements. Considering the conceptual frameworks of the autocracy and the legalism, Turkey can be regarded as a model of autocratic legalism that we also observe in case of Poland and Hungary. And still, this model is a rather complex and paradoxical. It sustains the depictions of authoritarianism from previous constitutional cycles and blends them with current arbitrariness practices. On the other hand, the legacies of liberal democratic constitutionalism interact with them. Therefore, the constitutional normativity serves to a set of conflicting interests and aims, either to coordinate autocracy or weaken it. And this reflects Turkey's constitutional trajectories, embedding the tension between liberal democratic constitutionalism and autocratic tendencies. The current backsliding uses the discourse and conventions of previous autocratic policies to influence the political behavior and control the institutions. However, the institutional learning of liberal democratic reflex is also provided by the legacies of Republican modernism, post-war constitutional democracy with a very strong emphasis on the judicial review, and cosmopolitan constitutionalism, particularly as regards the role of international treaties and Europeanization in Turkey. And this complexity represents uncertainty for the regime, that even the autocratic legalism does not always serve the interests of autocracy. In other words, the backsliding refers both to erosive strategies and paradoxes, including the democratic resilience and the democratic revival as another phenomenon. In terms of backsliding strategies, I would like to emphasize the charismatic and autocratic populism, the politicization of state institutions and the rule of law. When the democratic behavior of Turkey's current autocratic elite is analyzed from a perspective of liberal constitutional democracy, its characterizing feature is anti-constitutionalism. It challenges the democratic equilibrium by undermining the minimum constitutive elements of liberal democratic constitutionalism, namely the freedom of expression, freedom of association, the rule of law, and partly the fair elections. Turkey's anti-constitutionalism proceeds in an incremental process, can be deemed as the aggregation of erosive changes, and these are provided mainly through using constitutional mechanisms, constitutional constructs, and they are also deployed strategically. In other words, anti-constitutionalist policies do not prescribe a deconstitutionalization process, but a constitutional process, that the institutions and norms are specifically engineered and used. In this strategy, there are some unwritten but also common rules applied. Notably, the democratic and liberal elements are combined with the autocratic ones. Some rules and policies are prescribed shapelessly, that vague and uncertain constitutional legality may leave room for expansion of power if necessary. A hyper-legalism, availing the repressive use of judiciary and the selective and strategic use of liberal democratic norms and institutions, is also deployed to serve different ends. And the anti-constitutionalist feature of the democratic erosion in Turkey comes to the forefront, particularly in the field of judiciary, with a judicial capture, executive aggrandizement, and dissuasive practices regarding independent journalism and human rights defenders. And besides the structural changes of the newly introduced presidential system, the constitutional amendment process itself can be regarded as a consolidation arrangement between major regressive political forces in Turkey, and these include the AK Party, the conservative nationalist bloc. And Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention is also a recent example of the AK Party's regressive practices to expand its coalition with the Reuters social conservatives base. In terms of backsliding paradox, we can speak about the role of the NGOs, particularly the bar associations, and the engagement of Turkey's women movement. Despite the new legislation controlling the NGOs and the bar associations, the civic society's engagement has not slowed down. And the defense march of the lawyers from all cities to Ankara has made a very significant public impact. And many lawyers are still serving in civic society organizations for supporting human rights defenders and strategic litigation. The independent women NGOs has been another strength of Turkey's democratic capacity. As a matter of democratic resilience and democratic revival, the women's movement resistance against the gender backlash policies of autocratization deserves special attention. Despite difficulties arising from the regulatory framework, tight governmental control, including the use of force during demonstrations and the lack of resources, the independent women NGOs represent the most vivid and engaged part of the civic society against democratic erosion. And gender equality, consequently, is one of the most enduring principles of Turkey's constitutionalism that has assertive democratic ownership. The women NGOs are the only part of the civic society that regularly rise in massive demonstrations, bringing hundreds of thousands to the public sphere. Besides the civic protests, they apply different initiatives in a coordinated manner to build knowledge for an evidence-based policy debates, such as monitoring and shadow reports, capacity building activities, and the trial watch missions. And it is also noteworthy that progressive women's activists and conservative ones voice critical concerns about the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. From an institutional perspective, the backsliding paradox can be also tested regarding the Constitutional Court's performance. Although Turkey's democratic erosion hit the judiciary massively by reshufflings and repeated interventions, the Constitutional Court cannot be entirely regarded as a submissive court serving the regime's aims on all occasions. The individual application procedure adopted in 2010 constitutional amendments has served as a mechanism to rectify the individual cases' deficits. The court has used the individual application as a strategic opportunity to balance the negative impact of systematic violations in some crucial cases. Significantly, the court has increased its popularity through individual application case law against autocratization, particularly in rulings regarding significant journalism cases, and the individual application has served as a venue supporting the Constitutional Court's independence. And we have also clearly witnessed a shift of power towards the Constitutional Court. Here I would like to emphasize the shift of power towards the Constitutional Court from the government and from the lower courts as well. And strategic litigation has become salient as soon as the individual application came into force. The academics, the journalists, deputies, companies, peasants, lawyers, and all other ordinary citizens applied to the court to redress the violations, and the responsiveness of the court, as opposed to other public authorities, has been significantly higher. The recent statistics show that approximately 93% of the permissible applications favor claimants to redress the violation of constitutional rights between 2012 and 2020. This does not, of course, mean that the Constitutional Court has been always against autocratization policies. There are, of course, very significant patterns of submissiveness and subservience of the Constitutional Court. However, in general, as regards in the individual application procedure, the performance of the Constitutional Court has been relevant, better compared to other types of applications and legal remedies. Against all these evidences, in terms of Turkey's democratic stagnation, including backsliding strategies and backsliding paradoxes, the new constitution debate animated by the government begs the question, what would a constitutional process mean under the politics of anti-democracy? Such a constitutional engagement under the pressure of regressive and repressive policies differs from a democratic constitutional process. It may appeal primarily to the ruling elite's inter-party organization by keeping it mobilized and committed to a significant political project. It may also attract voter space by occupying the political agenda. Here, the constitutional discussions may frame the public debate and channel political outcomes by a pseudo-persuasion process. In other words, the constitutional debate may play an agenda-setting role, controlling the policy framing and contentious mobilization, including the mobilization and engagement of the women's movement. One thing is certain, the preconditions of a democratic constitution making with an emphasis on freedom of expression and freedom of association, securing a free public debate, are not met in Turkey at present. Restorative constitutionalism that Turkey ultimately needs cannot be provided under current circumstances. But if a proto-democratic threshold is achieved at the parliament in the upcoming elections, if Turkey can manage the competitiveness of the elections, this may pave the way for the reforms of a liberal constitutionalism with public support. I thank you very much for your interest, and I'm also looking forward to listening to your comments, insights, and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Oder. I think this was an excellent start to the debate, also in showing not just the difficulties and hurdles on the path to a democratic constitution in Turkey, but also in terms of pointing out at the resilience and complexity of Turkish politics and society as well, and basically to show where the cracks are in any prospects for change. So thank you very much for that. Now, before I move on to Professor Keyman, just a brief note to all the attendees. If you have any questions to the participants, to the floor, you can always use the Q&A tool on the screen, and I will try to group the questions and direct them to the presenters at the end of their presentations. Now, of course, when we talk about constitution making or the prospect of a liberal and democratic constitution in Turkey, automatically we're entering into the debates about the approaching centennial of the Republic. And we know that this is also mentioned a lot by the governing party as well, the need for a civilian constitution to mark the centennial of the Republic. But obviously, when we talk about the symbolism of that, that obviously takes us back to the early Republic and to the early constitutions and the way in which those constitutions were made, and whether or not we can draw any lessons from that as well, from Turkey's own particular history to that effect. And for that, of course, I turn to Professor Keyman, who I'm sure will enlighten us on this matter. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Senem. I would like to begin by thanking our friends in Columbia University, Holger and Sharon, for organizing this and accepting this idea. As Professor Oder said, you know, we are actually experiencing an interesting moment this year. On the one hand, we have a call from the government that Turkey needs a new and democratic constitution. But on the other hand, Turkey is one of the examples of democratic backsliding, competitive authoritarianism, so on and so forth. So the question actually is, Turkey can have a new civilian and democratic constitution while experiencing, you know, the democratic backsliding and the erosion of very significant institutions, including judicial system and the others. But the dilemma gets more complicated, Senem, as you said. We are this year, 2021, we are celebrating the 100th year of the Turkey's first constitution, 1921 constitution. And I would like to invite you guys to, or our participants and all of us go back to 100 years ago, 1921. And at that, when we do that, we see actually a country going through a very, very poor country in Anatolian geography, going through an independence war against the Western imperial powers. And the time of the Ottoman Empire is coming to the end, and very, very difficult conditions economically, sociologically, demographically, and we have this independence war. In the independence war, as we said, we know starts at 1919 and 1921. Turkey's first constitution was crafted in this time. So it is not today. It is not a sort of technologically advanced country. It is not economically, or despite all economic problems, economically sort of developed country, urbanized country. But it's under very, very difficult conditions, under the visionary leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. In 1921, Turkey had the first constitution. It was the fundamental law of Turkey for a brief period time from 1921 to 1924, and then the 1924 constitution came. It was the first constitution of modern Turkish state. It was ratified by the Grand National Assembly in January 1921, and it was amended to proclaim Turkey a republic. And let me emphasize that it was crafted by elected constituent assembly, in which different groups and different ideologies were not only present, but also actively participated in the making of the constitution. It was not an easy process. Professor Oder knows better than I do. It involved very, very heavy, difficult discussions, deliberations. It was not very sweet process, but at the end, that assembly was able to create or to amend a new constitution based on consensus. Article 1 of this constitution stated that sovereignty is rested upon the nation without condition. So it was a very revolutionary in the way, because it was done in the time from empire to a nation state, contracting the principle of national sovereignty. So from the Sultanate, we have actually a sort of transition to national sovereignty. It was a simple document consisting of 23 articles, short articles. 9 of them was laying down out the principles upon which the state would be founded. So they had to do with the governing principles of the new Turkey. Other 14 articles, interestingly, had to do with the local governance. As a matter of fact, in a very, very rural society, very, very poor society, the constitution envisioned a Turkey unfolding as an urban society. According to Bülent Taner, one of the most significant constitutional professors of Turkey, late Bülent Taner, 1921 constitution with all these principles was the only democratic constitution of Turkey's and Ottoman's 170 years old constitutional history. According to Ergun Özbudun, another important constitutional law professor, it was if I refer to Hannah Arendt, the constituted text for the new republic. It was revolutionary, it was democratic, it was constitutive, but at the same time, it was crafted in the elected assembly, and it was made on the basis of a consensus among different groups and different ideologies. The reason why I'm bringing the importance and the brief, sort of expose of the content of the 1921 Constitution to the participants of this webinar is that 100 years later, if Turkey is going to have a new and democratic constitution, I think in 1921, 1924, that constitution should be a benchmark for the new debates on or the new new constitution process, making process, more process in Turkey. 100 years later, I think if we are going to have a new and democratic constitution, we always remember the importance of the 1921 constitution, and the attempt should be aimed to go beyond the 1921 constitution. If that is possible, going back to a very accurate description of Turkey right now by Professor Oder, it is unlikely. It is unlikely that Turkey is going to go beyond the 1921 constitution. But what we have to remember that's why I actually called my presentation's first title, the first part is the remembering the past. We should remember the past because it also indicates that Turkey has the potential, historically, sociologically, intellectually, and politically, to make a new and democratic constitution. But it is unlikely if it is actually done by the way in which the new proposal sort of implies. But let me actually into 2020's Turkey. Let's ask these questions. Does Turkey need a new and democratic constitution? Yes, definitely Turkey needs a new constitution because without that it is impossible to get Turkey out of this backsliding problem or all these ambiguities. Should this new constitution, democratic constitution, made on the base of consensual politics? Yes, actually, it should be based on consensus. Thirdly, if we are going to have a new and democratic constitution, should that involve in the civil society participation and civil society deliberation? Yes, actually, definitely. Referring to Bruce Ackerman's 1, 2, and the third stages of constitution making, the first stage of constitution making should be based on civil society participation and deliberation before the crafting of the constitution. But the key question is, can Turkey, as it is, make this? Of course, unfortunately, the answer is unlikely. Unlikely because of all of the actual problems that the Professor Oder talked about. But if I actually put all of these problems together with reference to two general problems, first of all, Turkey is confronted by severe polarization, sort of promoted, advocated, and pushed by the political elite in the name of winning elections. So in this sense, we are talking about the possibility of new constitution in a very divided, severely polarized society. That actually means that Turkey definitely needs a new constitution to overcome severe polarization, but we have to have a different mindsetting, different approach to new constitution by remembering the past the 1921 constitution. The secondly, last 5 years, Turkish parliamentary democratic system has been going through a transformation. A radical shift occurred from a parliamentary democratic system to a kind of presidential system. But that presidential system is based on the fusion of power power in executive over the other branches of the state, and a very top-down governance of society. The existing call for new and democratic constitution comes from the government, who is going to push the fortification, consolidation of this kind of system in the new constitution. But that is from the beginning criticized and also rejected by the opposition parties, opposition groups, civil society organizations, and there are very significant calls, societal calls right now for what is called the strengthened parliamentary democracy, returning to strengthened parliamentary democracy. So in this sense, if we are going to have a new and democratic constitution, we have to also discuss very seriously and through societal deliberation to what extent we need a constitutional system, to what extent we need to create a new parliamentary democratic system to overcome certain problems or to overcome the democratic backsliding of Turkey. So in this sense, from a real politics or real politics, the government's call for a new and democratic constitution is not going to be accepted by the larger part of the society because there are, fundamental significant differences. To start with the governing principles, the main governing principles of Turkey, whether it is a presidential system or the strengthened parliamentary system. But on the other hand, there is a big problem of trust stemming from the problem of severe polarization. This is a pessimistic point of view, but nevertheless, I like to go back to the first part of the title of my presentation, remembering the past. If Turkey was able to come up with a democratic revolutionary constitution in 1921, why not right now? Turkey has the potential to do that. But if we are going to have a new and democratic constitution, let me make three statements to finish my presentation. Then we have to ask actually what kind of fundamental principles on which we have to agree to start the deliberation process. First of all, we have to actually accept that the Turkey we live in is a very urban society, 75% urban, with, despite all the economic problems, with a significant development of middle class formations, educated urban and middle class formation. This strata, not from secular identities, but also the other kind of identity, conservative, Kurdish, and others. All of the public opinion surveys indicate that the middle educated urban classes in Turkey, going through the recent elections from the referendum, constitutional referendum 2016, 17 to 2019, 2020 local elections and the other elections, this strata wants a plural, democratic Turkey with trust, with a strengthened culture of living together. So they don't want the fusion of power; they want the shared of power. They don't want the extreme power of executive branch. They want the independence and of the judiciary. They don't want the majority of or hegemony of one identity. They want living together within diversity. So in this sense, I think the new and democratic constitution of Turkey should recognize the sociology and demography of Turkey, which wants actually much more stability, trust, and living together based on the principles of human rights, freedom of expression, and democracy. Secondly, one of the big problems right now with Turkey, in addition to democracy, is the governance, the existing presidential governance of Turkey, which has created a very significant erosion of institutions and separation of power in Turkey. As a matter of fact, what I'm trying to say is that the new presidential system, a kind of presidential system that is governing Turkey, does not like what we call checks and balances. So in this sense, they want to operate without reference to checks and balances. And checks and balances mean, from my own perspective, not only the separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judiciary branches of the state, and the independence of judiciary, but also the importance of local governance, which coincides with the highly urban structure of Turkey, and equal citizenship among different identities. Four principles: separation of powers, independence of judiciary, strengthening local governance, and equal citizenship constitute a very important benchmark for the new constitution, which we call an effective system of checks and balances. So in this sense, a new and democratic constitution should be based on a very strong and effective checks and balances, not only horizontally in terms of governing principles, separation of powers and independence of judiciary, but also vertically, strong local governance, strong decentralization, and equal citizenship among diversities. Without that, Turkey will continue in this process of backsliding, which it doesn't deserve. Let's remember 1921. Let's remember the visionary structure of 1921 in its 100th year of anniversary, and let's actually make a call. This I would like to make a call right now, that if we are going to start the process of new and democratic constitution for Turkey, it should be actually go beyond the 1921, and it should be based on the urban society with effective checks and balance system of exchange balances and equal citizenship among different identities. It is only that way that Turkey actually can get out of this backsliding, get out of this erosion, and get out of this lack of trust problems. This is what Turkey needs, and I hope in the near future we will actually discuss the new and democratic constitution on the basis of remembering the 1921. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Keyman. That's been great to also go back to the past and remember the 1921 Constitution and the lessons that we can draw from that, and how going beyond the 21 Constitution might and would look like for Turkey if it took that path. Now I'm going to turn to Tsveta Petrova, because so far we've been talking mostly about Turkey. But obviously what we've been discussing in the context of Turkey, I think, which is probably obvious to you by now as well, very much holds for some of the cases in Central and Eastern Europe. If you look at the way in which the constitutions are violated or manipulated by autocratic actors, and how fundamental freedoms have been gradually violated and limited by these political actors, and the gradual erosion of fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law, in my opinion, shows us that there is in fact very much a transnational phenomena that we're talking about that goes beyond Turkey, that even goes beyond Central and Eastern Europe, of course. But if we'd have to zoom in on the case of Central and Eastern Europe, since it seems to be the topic or the subject of democratic erosion in the context of Europe and the European Union as well, what would you have to tell us about this? Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to think about the constitutional crisis in Central and Eastern Europe in this broader comparative context. And in a way, I pick up very much where Professor Keyman ended. What I was hoping to do today is really talk about Central and Eastern Europe, but the crisis from the perspective of the population. And the question that I want to pose is, why is it that the public in Central and Eastern Europe is supporting the constitutional rollback, the democratic rollback in the region? And I hope to argue that this public acceptance is based on a desire for total sovereignty for the party representing the will of the nation, which is embedded in a broader rejection of the transition of the democratization process. Let me start first by describing a flashpoint in this constitutional crisis, which in Hungary began in 2010 with the election of the Fidesz party, the center-right Fidesz party, which has over time drifted further to the right. And in Poland, it began in the mid-2010s with the election of the right Law and Justice Party. In Hungary, Fidesz quickly set about using its then 2/3 supermajority to change the constitution. And the first strike was that it raised the number of justices on the Constitutional Court and then appointed its own. And then it started lowering the retirement age for judges and prosecutors, thus freeing up spots for Fidesz loyalists. And the latest estimates I saw is that Fidesz has, over the last decade, managed to appoint 400 of its own lawyers in various posts in the judiciary. And then Fidesz set up a national judiciary office, which is run by the wife of a very close associate of the leader of the Fidesz party, Viktor Orban. And that office then can veto judicial appointments and influence which judges hold which cases. So even by the mid-2010s, Fidesz enjoyed control over prosecutors' offices, the Constitutional Court, and the highest courts of appeal. Subsequently, Fidesz managed to push a new constitution, which violated some rights and freedoms. And despite that it was contested, even though it was contested, Fidesz managed to push it through. In 2018, there was a new strike again, this time against in the form of a new code of procedure, which gave courts powers to reject civil filings very easily. And then the government went further and is now is in the process of creating of a new system of administrative courts in which the judiciary ministry would have direct influence. And these courts would handle, among other things, disputes over the media and elections in areas where regular courts could rule against the government, but likely will not be able to do so in the future. The Council of Europe, specifically the Venice Commission, has investigated that without much success. Now, turning to Poland, we see a very similar line of attack against checks and balances in the country. And that started in 2015 when Law and Justice managed to have its presidential candidate win the election. And the minute he did, what he did is that he refused to swear in some of the appointees, the judiciary nominated to the Constitutional Tribunal. And this new president waited until Law and Justice took office in the fall of the same year and elected its own replacements to the Constitutional Tribunal. There was a lot of back and forth within the judicial system and in streets where we've seen mass protests. And in the end, Law and Justice managed to pass a series of laws through which both the Sejm and the Senate compelled the Constitutional Tribunal to allow the new Law and Justice judges to hear cases. Again, Law and Justice didn't stop there. That was a swift victory, but they moved on in 2017, when similarly to Hungary, the Sejm and the Senate passed a new law that mandated the retirement for all judges, initially over the age of 70, eventually over the age of 65. And in a similar way to Hungary, they started packing courts, giving significant control of the government over judges and their livelihoods. And then in the latest conflict in 2019, the Sejm voted to allow the disciplinary chamber of the Supreme Court of Poland to remove judges which were deemed to be taking part in what is considered or what could be suspected or alleged to be political activity. So as a result of this, the government has de facto control of the entire Polish judicial arm of the state. And this law also gave the government greater control over the appointments to the position of the head judge of the Supreme Court of Poland. So this, similarly to the Hungarian case, the EU has objected in a historic decision. The European Court of Justice ruled against Poland, ordering it to suspend some of these laws which interfere with the independence of the judiciary, but these rulings have been largely ignored. So what I wanted to ask and think about today is this set of crises, which is embedded in a broader autocratization push, in a broader democratic rollback in both Poland and the region, where we see concerted attempts by governments, center-right governments in power, to undermine judicial and media independence, and to also constrain certain expressions of civil and political activism. And again, these are some of these are trends that we heard about discussed in Poland, in Turkey as well. So, taking this democratic rollback, what is interesting is that these governments have, despite that, managed to win consecutive elections. And what I would like to understand is why. Why is it that the public continues to support these parties that are going against what was broadly defined as a national agenda for these countries over the last 25 years? So I want to look at the popular sentiments on this. And I'm thinking about these developments in this broader wave of autocratization around the world, which is currently within the master frame of populism. And in this literature on global populism, if we think about the public or the demand side, there are broadly three types of explanations of why publics support populist leaders and their movements. And they're all based on a perceived set of insecurities. Some of those speak of an ontological security, or those would be activated authoritarians, individuals that have psychological disposition to favor order and hierarchy, but in this political context feel threatened and demand rulers who will institute law and order in the country. An alternative explanation speaks to a set of economic insecurities, which are broadly a class of arguments about those who are left behind economically and who are looking for redress, who are looking for protection from the states. And then finally, there are those who put forward explanations that speak to a cultural insecurity, where populist movements are really mobilizing those who are reacting against progressive, socially, but also economically progressive world value changes. Of course, these are broader explanations that have their distinct social construction within the post-communist space. And in the literature on Eastern Europe, what we see instead are variants of these arguments, but that are centered on the post-communist transitions that began in the region in 1989. And so some of these explanations speak to the chaos and frequent reform and change of the democratization process, which has compelled some to, again, demand stability and order and certain social hierarchy. Alternatively, others look at the losers of these democratization changes, especially in socioeconomic terms. And here we oftentimes hear similar cleavages between urban, more transnational, open, international, globalized elites versus more rural, conservative areas that are considered the losers of the election process in the region. And finally, there is a different version of this losers and winners of the transition argument, which looks at the cultural wars instead, between national conservatives wanting to protect the nation on the one hand and pro-European liberals on the other hand. So I take these three sets of insecurities in work that I have done together with my co-author, Maria Sneguvaya, who is a postdoc at Virginia Tech. And what we do with those is we look at the European Social Survey, focusing on Poland and Hungary in the time period between 2004 and 2018. And we look at the attitudes that citizens have expressed in that survey. And for each type of insecurity, we collected a set of questions that would speak to that type of insecurity. So here you can see how we have operationalized economic, ontological, and cultural security, very much speaking to some of these arguments that are articulated for Eastern Europe and in the broader literature on globalism, global populism. So we took these questions, and the first thing that we did is to run a principal axis factoring, because we expected that many of these attitudes would naturally cluster together, and we wanted to see what that clustering is. And in a way consistent with our expectations, we see some of these insecurities defined through the factors that were EODed in our analysis. And we see three sets of factors as important. The first one we call a domestic transition referendum, where the root of this factor is really economic insecurity, because you see state of health services, education, satisfaction with the present state of the economy in the country play a key role. But what's also interesting is that we see some political variables in here as well. So satisfaction with the state of democracy in the country and trust in the country and the European Parliament are also factored in. And to us, that makes a lot of sense, because the transition away from communism was really a transition that's both political and economic at the same time. And it was really defined in the region as a transition to market democracy. So it's the domestic transition that the first factor is capturing. The second one maps really neatly on what we've called ontological insecurity, or this demand for law, order, and social hierarchy. And then the third factor is also interested in a specific distinctive to the region, where which we've defined as international transition referendum, because here we see some of the cultural insecurity variables, such as trust in the United Nations, the European Parliament, in the country's parliament, as well as some of the socially progressive values, such as support for various lifestyles and multiculturalism. But here again, you will notice that support for democracy and these socially progressive values are bundled together, because of course the transition in Eastern Europe was one of domestic change as well as opening to the broader international system, which allowed the Euro-Atlantic values to play significant influence. Okay, moving on very quickly, we looked at share of vote for the party, as well as whether the party was incumbency, and we implemented a set of traditional controls. And then what we did is we looked at the factors that drive support for populists while they were in opposition and compared to support for populists when they're already in government. And what you will see here is that perhaps the most robust driver of support for populism is the domestic transition referendum, or these variables that are rooted in the economic insecurity and support for democracy. And so these who perceive the political economy of their country as unsatisfactory tend to vote for populists. And we see that both in Hungary and in Poland. The second factor that is important in driving support for populists while they're in opposition is cultural insecurity, or this resistance to some of the liberal values that the West is promoting in the post-Cold War space. What's interesting is when we compare those results to support for populists when they're already in power, right? So now they have implemented some of these pushbacks on the democratic transition, and still they win the support win in elections. And again, here, the most robust driver is economic insecurity or the domestic transition referendum. But interestingly, the sign of this factor has reversed. And what that tells us that while some people rejected the transition when populists were in opposition, they are supportive of that transition now that populists are in power. Again, we see some significance of the international transition or cultural insecurity. And interestingly, now the ontological insecurity, or this desire for law and order, becomes important as these parties use the resources of the state to create a sense of disorder and demand for their protection. Okay, in trying to wrap up, what are the conclusions that we've drawn? We see support for populism really as rejection of this post-communist transition, both in its domestic processes of change, but also in the processes of opening up an embrace of Western values. And so bringing us, thinking back to the question of constitutional crisis, what this tells us is that there is a significant share of the electorate that believes that there must not and cannot be checks on the will of the nation. So I'll stop here. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to think about Hungary and Poland in the context of the changes and developments in Turkey as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Petrova. I think that was excellent in sort of gouging the popular perceptions and the popular and societal roots of support for populists in government and in opposition. And I think, and I'm sure that, many of those arguments also resonate with Turkey observers as well, in sense of, the sort of cultural insecurity, the ontological insecurity, but also, of course, the economics issue. But of course, much still remains to be researched. Now, there have been questions that have been coming in, and I've been trying to group them. So if you allow me, we have roughly around, just about 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to try and group them and direct them to each participant, but in case you'd like to respond to a question that I directed to another participant, please feel free to chip in and comment on that as well. I think we can move in the order of the speakers, so I think I'm going to start with Professor Oder first. Now, Professor Oder, there was a question directly posed to you by Okan Tan. And the question is that, can we trace the process of constitutional backsliding in Turkey to the constitutional revisions made in 2007 and 2010? So that was one question. And perhaps the second question that I thought would be relevant for you as well, but of course, Fuat Keyman can also pick up on this if he'd like to, is that the idea that, there's a lot of polarization in Turkey, which we've already been writing and discussing about as well. And even if we assume that a democratic constitution is established, what would happen if a certain branch of government ignores and disobeys it? Basically, what do we need to do to ensure that we don't have a situation once again where Turkish democracy fails to protect itself? So that was a question posed by Ege Erdoğan. So I think we can begin with you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for this very significant and insightful questions. The 2010 constitutional amendments have introduced very significant changes regarding the Constitutional Court and the Council of Judges and Prosecutors, because those amendments actually reshuffled the Constitutional Court, expanded the bench, and in terms of Council of Judges and Prosecutors, there was a new procedure for the composition. And the amendments did not respond to the long-standing demands for a new judicial governance that should secure impartiality and independence. For instance, the Minister of Justice's presiding role was preserved in the Council of Judges and Prosecutors. However, the Council's composition was altered by adopting a new judicial election system based on the voting rights of first-ranking judges and prosecutors. And the Constitutional Court intervened, actually, and it changed the draft. And the new system allowed a single list majority instead of the one person, one vote principle. Consequently, the partisan judges captured the council by a single list. The 2010 constitutional amendments provided a seemingly soft but highly controversial judicial reshuffling. The term limits, selection procedure, and eligibility criteria of constitutional judges were changed, while the governmental circles presented it as the rule of law reform against secularist tutelage or tutelary democracy. The opponents voiced court packing and judicial independence concerns. Overall, the 2010 amendments paved the way to making excessively partisan interventions, for a politicized and controlled judiciary. However, the amendments, particularly the statutory amendments, should be also taken into account in this respect, because shortly after the 2010 constitutional amendments, similar institutional reshuffling strategies were applied to other vital judicial institutions, such as the Court of Appeals, such as the Conseil d'Etat, the highest administrative court of Turkey. And in 2014, there was another legislative package. As soon as the alliance between AK Party and the Gülenist bureaucracy collapsed, there was another radical change in the judiciary. And finally, in the recent presidential amendment package, there were also specific provisions for reshuffling the Council of Judges and Prosecutors. Again, in other words, 2010 constitutional amendments opened actually the way of interventions regarding the judiciary, and the partisanship and the patronage within the judiciary has been totally increased. And as regards the 2007 constitutional amendments, I am truly doubtful, because it is now consolidated with the constitutional amendments in 2017. In other words, in fact, due to formal and informal arrangements provided by the constitution and constitutional conventions, and with the charismatic popularity of the President Erdogan, the executive aggrandizement could have been provided, in fact. However, the constitutional amendment package in 2017 should be deemed crucial, because it has provided a legitimization for an excessively augmented executive for the first time in the Turkish constitutional design, particularly with the help of executive decrees and shapeless and very vague norms. And the second question, as regards the democratic feature of Turkey, or the constitutional feature of Turkey, polarization and other issues, or the protection of Turkish constitutional democracy, I personally think that the democratic ownership and the civic vigilance are crucial factors. However, if Turkey takes the way of making a new constitution in democratic terms, as regards the process and as regards the content, we should also think about a new type of institutionalization. The post-war constitutionalism in Turkey has adopted significant institutions, particularly the Constitutional Court, and put emphasis on the judicial review as a crucial element of checks of balances for a constitutional democracy. However, the other institutions, and particularly political institutions, are quite significant, and we should also take into account the role of intermediaries in a constitutional democracy. As regards the political institutions, first, the political parties, and second, the parliament itself should be enhanced in terms of democratic ownership, in terms of democratic practices. And the intermediaries, again, the political agents, the internal structure of the political parties, and the owners of constitutional democracy, such as the journalists, such as the associations, the human rights defenders, the bar associations, and all those civic institutions, and their statutory legislation should be enhanced for a very meaningful ownership. And in this respect, opening the ways of legal remedies and an inclusive decision-making model, not only as regards the constitution-making process, but also as regards the legislative process, should be taken into account. And besides the institutional channels, Turkey should also take into account semi-institutional channels, or or the inclusion of the civic society in the decision-making process, not only at the national level, but also at the local level, should be taken into account. In general, I would also support a constitutional project endorsing the capacities of the local government, particularly as regards the metropolitan cities. The role of cities, and particularly the metropolitan cities, should be deemed crucial for the future of constitutional democracy, not only in Turkey, but globally. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Oder, for these clarifications. And I'm now going to turn to Professor Keyman. There are many questions for Professor Keyman, so I'll try to summarize them, Hocam. Okay, let me begin with this one. There's a question from Ohannes Kılıçda. He mentions the fact that the non-Muslim minorities were excluded from the drafting of the constitution in 1920 and 1921. And he's just asking whether or not that signifies a certain malaise, from within the Turkish political system, which we suffer today, and whether that should also be a lesson or a symptom of a problem that we have to keep in mind. So that's one question that relates to the 1921 constitution. Now, there are also questions regarding sort of future that are posed to Professor Keyman. Habib Aydın asked a question about the Kurdish issue and whether you see any prospects for another peace process on the horizon, whether you think that that is possible in the near future, given the constraints. And there's also a question from Neşecan Balkan on the role of the opposition. I mean, I know that Professor Oder has also touched upon this, but also whether you can share with us your ideas on how effective you think the opposition can be in this constitution making process. And finally, a question from Elena Duk, which I'm also going to pose to Tsveta Petrova as well in the context of Hungary and Poland, but that relates to the role of external actors. There is a specific question on the European Union, for instance. How can external actors strengthen the resilience of those domestic actors that resist autocracy in Turkey, but also beyond Turkey in Central and Eastern Europe as well? So I know that's quite a lot to digest, Fuat Hocam, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for these questions. In recent years, even in the AK Party, AK Party rule, there were two constitution making or civil and democratic constitution making experience, 2007 and 2011. And 2011 was very serious. And I personally, academically, and also Istanbul Policy Center, we were involved in it and worked very, very hard for that one. I don't know what the Professor Oder said, but there was a possibility, and but it failed, not because of civil society, not because of society, but because of the fact that the politicians and political leaders prioritize their interest over what is good for society. So they were actually are the ones that created this failure. And so in this sense, I always believe the importance of what Professor Oder said, the importance of civil society organizations, local governance, the increasing importance and effectivity of cities. That's what I meant by the urban Turkey. The new constitution should involve the recognition that Turkey is no longer a transitional society. Is a urban society with organizations, class structures, and identities. In those experiences, 2007 and 2011, there were a number of public opinion surveys, and it was interesting that the 1921 constitution was the one that still had consensus among societal actors. Kurdish people, non-Muslim minorities, Alawite, Yad, LGBT, all of them actually paid attention to the 1921 constitution and saw 1921 constitution much much democratic, much conducive to a better and democratic and liberal plural constitution for Turkey than the others. So in this sense, I agree with my friend's question about the non-Muslim minorities, but nevertheless, actually, if we are going to have a constitution that is going to be inclusive, not only democratic but inclusive, and then creating a sort of a culture of living together within diversity based on equal citizenship, then I think we have an experience of 1921 or 1924. And then the second question, the Kurdish question, the elaboration of or the possible solutions of the Kurdish question, I think we have come to the realization that despite focusing on sort of solution or peace processes on identities, Alawites, Kurds, LGBTs, and everything, I think we need a sort of a general framework to actually deal with all of these things, and that is the importance of new and democratic constitution. And I think we have to agree with this new constitution as a modus vivendi, as a foundation for dealing with the problems of each identities. And as a matter of fact, I was working in the peace process as one of the members of the Wise People Commission. It was a lost opportunity, but it was no support from the government and the other actors, but also it had no actually sort of a constitutional foundation to deal with, with it, not only based on the Kurdish question, but the other, problems and of the other identities and their problems. One thing actually, the Professor Petrova's economic insecurity, in terms of opposition, since the 2018, the opposition, not only in terms of opposition parties, but also local governance, civil society organizations, they are becoming vibrant. And there was also a Senem question about why Mr. Erdogan, Mr. President, is still popular. I think Professor Petrova's analysis is quite correct for Turkey. Economic insecurity is one of the main reason for the growing dynamism of opposition forces in Turkey. But the popularity of Mr. Erdogan still rests in his ability to economically deliver to those who have actually economic insecurity. But nevertheless, the existing government and Mr. Erdogan is no longer able to deliver as much as he used to before 2018. I think 2018 economic crisis is a kind of a threshold in Turkey. And I think why Turkey needs a new and democratic constitution is because we need to deal with ontological, economic, and cultural insecurities of society. That would actually start with the new foundation, new social contract, and new actually constitutional framework, in line of what Professor Oder described. I fully agree with her. And let me actually stop here, Senem. I hope I answered the questions. If there is any question left, but I have taken notes, but that's okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Keyman. And now I'm going to turn to Tsveta Petrova, our third speaker, for the questions. Now, there are a number of questions, Tsveta, addressed to you. Well, one question that is addressed not just in the context of Turkey, but also in the context of Central and Eastern Europe, and Shehriban Irmak and Kyle Zuhrer pointed this out, this issue of women's rights, right? I mean, recently, as Professor Oder also mentioned in her presentation, we have witnessed Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. And we have then also witnessed how we've seen statements of support from Hungary and Poland, again, going to show that this issue transcends borders and boundaries. Now, how would you read this? The fact that this women's rights, LGBT plus rights, they seem to be a major bone of contention in all these three settings. So I'd like to hear your views on that. There's also another question regarding this notion of ontological security or insecurity, which you've brought up. And the question is whether you see a possibility for bridging ontological security with emotions in the case of Poland and Hungary. This is posed by Arman Ermihan. And finally, a comment and a question by our very own Professor Ayşe Kadıoğlu from Sabancı University. She states that when constitutions are not framed on the basis of universal democratic principles, such as the ones laid out by the Venice Commission, they can be used in authoritarian consolidation, which seems to be the case in Turkey. Could you say that there exists such a constitution in Poland? If that is the case, then how can we understand the citizens' demonstrations in defense of the constitution in 2018 in acts of constitutional patriotism? So, Tsveta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me start with the question that you posed on the role of external actors, because I think it's an interesting and important one, and it's really tricky. I think in a way, we've seen a lot of pushback, especially recently by the EU and its various institutions and then leaders. But in a way, it's been a delayed set of sanctions. And because of that, we are also seeing that they're backfiring. The EU seems to have lost its normative power and its ability to shape outcomes in Central Europe. And that's in part because it acted too late and it acted perhaps too weakly. The time for pushback was in the early 2010s when we saw the first attempts, but when the EU hesitated. And so what could the EU do now? I think, if you believe our analysis, this idea of economic insecurity or a pushback on the transition, especially in the domestic, but also the international dimension, is in a way, it speaks to the fact that the citizens in the region are evaluating their regime, the democracy at home, in terms of its performance, in terms of its output legitimacy. And if we follow that logic, what the EU could really do is deliver for the citizens in Central Europe. We saw a lot of disappointment with the EU in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis and the aftermath of the migrant crisis in Europe. And those are major challenges that the EU, you could argue, mishandled. And so seeing the EU rise up now in the management of the pandemic would be a welcome development, but it's still TBD. Okay, there was another question on output on ontological insecurity, and that kind of follows up on my comment just now. It's interesting to think about it because if you read the news coverage in Europe and in the region on the rise of these populists and their pushback, their rollback of democracy, you might get the picture that the migrant crisis was a major precipitating event. And usually the migrant crisis is either interpreted as ontological insecurity or cultural insecurity. But again, our analysis shows that this desire for law and order is not really what brings populists to power. Instead, once they do, they use the state apparatus and media to create a sense of insecurity that then they exploit. But it has a marginal impact really, relative to the other two factors. So I would really encourage you to use it, interpret it in that way, and think more about the economic and cultural insecurity. So that brings me to the question of women's rights, which has been really fascinating. And so in this vision, in this conservative vision of what the nation is that both parties are pushing, the family, the nation, religion have a particular reading, which then dictates a policy on women's rights and women's movements. And it's been fascinating just how contested that policy has been, which is a mix of different things. I see it in part as building on some legacies of communism about participation of women, especially in the labor force. But that's also coupled with paternalistic cultures that are now revived through religious movements and the rise of religious mobilization and civic organizing in the region. And so the two are coming in clash. And it's interesting that in Hungary, we see a cultural push against women's rights, but a toleration and acceptance and even encouragement of women's participation in the economy. And we see something similar in Poland, but with a lot more emphasis on cultural and socially regressive measures. And it's been on women's rights that the government has had to take back some of its actions. So to me, that's one of the interesting forefronts of contention between populists and their opposition. And I believe with that, I answered all of your questions, or at least I hope I did.
Okay, thank you so much, Tsveta. It was wonderful to listen to you too. And I think we are now approaching the end of our panel and also the end of our event. There was a question as to whether or not there'll be recording of the event. Yes, there will be. And that recording will be distributed very soon. But for the closing comments, I would like to invite back Mr. Holger Klein from the European Institute at Columbia.
Thank
yes,
you
Professor
very much,
Klein.
Senem. I will only close this event by praising the panel and the organization of the panel. Thank you so much, Senem, for exemplary moderation of an exciting and fascinating panel on these subjects. Our panelists, Fuat, Keyman at the helm, who has brought this group together, Professor Oder, Professor Petrova, a fascinating panel. I will revisit it once it is available as a recording, which indeed will be soon. I would like to thank all of our attendees across the world for joining us for this exciting discussion, which was very insightful and is timely in this moment of the celebration of 100 years of the constitution, the first constitution in Turkey. We hope that you will follow us in the future and attend more events, follow us on Twitter, or sign up to receive our invitations for programming on our Sakıp Sabancı Center website at sakıpsabancıcenter.columbia.edu. Last but not least, I would like to thank the institutions that have made this event possible, namely the Istanbul Policy Center, Sabancı University, and the Sakıp Sabancı Center here at Columbia University. This is only one of many events on subjects centered on Turkey, Turkish politics, issues of constitutionalism, autocratic regimes, democratic backsliding, many other topics that we have covered in the past. And we are inviting you to future events of this kind in the coming months and years. So until then, I thank you again, wherever you are in Europe, in Turkey, in the United States and beyond. Have a good rest of the day, whether it's the afternoon or the evening, and I will see you again, I'm sure. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you also to Professor Leblebici, who is joining us here again on the screen for these final remarks. Bye-bye.